Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. I'm thrilled to be here with author and historian Noah Charney, who is actually coming to us from Slovenia. I've heard it's kind of a funky time over there, but I'm so bad with time zones. I'm just assuming it's a good time for Noah to be here. Before I hand it over to Noah, though, I just wanted to say a couple things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. I would like to thank Noah for letting us share this program with other libraries because, when libraries get together, we like make magic. And we did with this program with a lot of people signed up. So I'd like to welcome the patrons who learned about us from Hanover, Bedford, Brookline, Tewksbury, and of course from Ashland because, we're awesome. So Noah's going to be speaking for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have time for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A. You can buy signed books by Noah from Aesop's Fable. I will put that link in the chat. And of course, you can get his books from your local libraries. So Noah is a world-renowned best-selling author of books about art history, about art crime. He has won many awards. Like I said, he's coming to us from Slovenia. And his current book really tells a story of women in art and how, in some instances, they've been left behind, but they've really shaped the art world. I'm really, really fascinated with this topic, Noah. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I love how many people you got. This library team network really does wonders. So I'm delighted to be visiting you. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, so Red Sox territory. But I've lived for more than a decade in Slovenia. And I spent since 2002 living in Europe. And I am a professor of art history specializing in art crime. But I got interested in the story of women in art when I wrote a book that came out in 2017 called The Collector of Lives, Giorgio Vasari and the Invention of Art. So Vasari was the godfather of art history, the first art historian. He was also a great Renaissance artist. He was the court painter to the Medici in Florence. And he's best known for a book called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And that was a group biography of artists, many of whom he knew since he was a Renaissance artist himself. And in that book, he left out quite a few very famous artists, but included some artists who are largely unfamiliar to the general public. And he has a whole chapter on women artists. And I felt like this was a good point of entry because there are so many great women artists, but it can be tricky to give them the spotlight they deserve. I guess that's the best way to phrase it, until you get to the 20th century when there's so many significant women artists that you no longer have to think hard to keep score. And so that's why I got the idea to do this book, to try to shed light on an overlooked or brushed aside group of artists. But there have been and are some very good books about women artists. What I tried to do was something different. I didn't want to do something encyclopedic, and I didn't want to only focus on women artists because that had already been done. What's unique about this book is it tries to show a 360-degree view of how women influenced the art world. So artists are one part of it, and I actually have the first section of the book is a history of art with all of the most relevant movements represented, but with an exemplary female artist to represent that movement instead of the cliche classic famous male artist that you get in most art history books. Then the rest of the book is about women in different fields of art. So we have patrons, models, muses, scholars, critics, collectors, curators, and trying to give as broad and diverse a view of how women have positively affected the art world. I've written over 20 books now, believe it or not. And if any of them interest you, they make great Christmas presents, Hanukkah presents, whatever you're into. This one is one of several that have just come out. I have one about Slavic mythology because I live in Slovenia now. I got interested in Slavic myths. And shortly, a book on NFTs and their place in this history of art and collecting will come out. And then in the winter, I have a book about the Mona Lisa. So if any of those interest you, getting them from a local library like Aesop's Fable sounds like the way to do it. But and any way you'd like, I would be delighted if you're interested in some of the books as well. But I also do all sorts of other things. I'm a strange sort of pop professor. I do a lot of public outreach. If you're interested I host TV shows and radio programs, and I teach online courses. In fact, tomorrow, an online course about foraging that I'm co-teaching begins through Atlas Obscura. I also teach about art theft through Atlas Obscura. And I host some programs, like there was a BBC series I hosted called China's Stolen Treasures. I write some videos for the TED platform. And if you're familiar with Wondrium or the teaching company, I have a course called Lost Art there. So there are lots of ways that we can follow up if you're interested in the sort of work that I'm doing. So let's take a look at the subject of this book. And I'm going to ask you a question rhetorically because there's too many of you. How many female artists could you name? Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marina Abramovic. Okay, but how about female artists who lived prior to the modern era? Maybe Artemisia Gentileschi, and then, well, even a regular museum goer might run out of steam. There's this colossal gap in the offering of books about art. I mean, even a quick Amazon search for books on women in art reveals this chasm. So there are monographs dealing with some prominent female artists, and there's some encyclopedic gallery books that show, for example, one work by each female artist with hundreds represented, but less than a paragraph of text about each. But the women represented in books in general about art is appallingly small. There's a historical reason for the limited presence of women as artists until the 20th century. So art, as almost all professions, was considered the realm of men, and the patriarchal society, deliberately designed to be institutionally misogynistic, upheld this. Until the 18th century, there was this guild system in place that controlled who was permitted in any given city or region to run a professional artist studio. The masters of the guild, and they were inevitably called the Guild of St. Luke, Luke being the patron saint of painters, due to an apocryphal story that he painted an icon of the Virgin Mary. Well, they were all men, and only men were accepted. And what they did to be accepted into the guild was they had to submit what was called a masterpiece. That's the origin of the term. Now we use it for any great work of art, but it literally means the piece you submit to the guild to determine whether you'll be accepted as a master and therefore able to open your own studio, have your own assistants and apprentices, and take commissions within that territory. So the studio of an artist was really like a gym locker room. It was teenage boys, probably very sweaty and smelly, unpaid apprentices, paid assistants, men and boys aged 8 and up, all living on site. And at the time, it would have been considered both awkward and maybe even a romantic distraction to have girls in the midst of the studio. So this meant that with precious few exceptions, the only female artists prior to the dissolution of the guild system were relatives of established masters. The most famous of the bunch is surely Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the great painters of Baroque Italy, who learned her craft because her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was likewise a great painter with his own studio in which she could practice. Women created art informally throughout history as a hobby, but often exhibiting brilliant talent, but it was the professional gates that remained closed to them. They began to open somewhat when the guild system shifted to a system of academies, the first of which opened in Florence in the 16th century. But these were likewise run by men and for men. Although the number of female professional artists expanded in the 19th century, they were still the exceptions to the rule and were often looked upon as curiosities, complemented with variations on the odoriferously misogynistic, but at the time well-meaning phrase, quote, "She paints so well, you'd think she were a man." Now, by the time the 20th century rolled around, female artists were no longer rare, and particularly after the First World War, with painting schools finally open to them, the guild chokehold weakened, and an increasing acceptance of women in the workplace in the still patriarchal society the world over meant that there was no shortage of excellent and influential female artists. But prior to the 20th century, they can really be counted in the dozens. So I mentioned before, but much of what we know about Renaissance art history comes to us through Giorgio Vasari's The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which was first published in 1550, and then a second edition in 1562. This is considered the first art history book proper, making Vasari the godfather of the field of study. It's a group biography of important artists, many of whom Vasari, who was court painter and architect to Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, knew personally. If you're familiar with any works by Vasari, he painted the cupola of the Duomo in Florence, and he designed the Uffizi, which is now a famous museum, but used to be the offices of the Duchy of Tuscany. Those are probably his most prominent works. So he mentioned a few women artists, and they must have been truly noteworthy for him to bother including them, since his Tuscan-focused outlook on what makes art worthy of inclusion resulted in him sidelining or entirely excluding some very important artists from elsewhere in Italy or Europe. The only woman who received a full chapter in her life in Vasari's book was Properzia de Rossi. She was from Bologna, and it's within the Properzia chapter that Vasari mentions some other women artists of note. He quotes the medieval poet Ludovico Ariosto in this chapter, quote, "Women have achieved excellence in every art they have given care to." Vasari backs this up with his text on Properzia and a lady who has just about the best name I could ever imagine, Sophonisba Anguissola. What a great name. And we'll hear about her in a moment. So this was impressive that he mentioned them with such praise, since some of the most famous male artists of the Renaissance, including Albrecht Dürer and Jan van Eyck, did not receive chapters of their own, while Properzia did. Vasari lavishes praise on Properzia, although, let's be honest, today it reads as underhandedly misogynistic, but I promise he had every good intention when he said this, quote, "Nor have women been ashamed to put their tender white hands to the mechanical things, and amid the coarseness of marble and the roughness of iron, to follow their desires and bring fame to themselves, as did our Properzia de Rossi, a young woman talented not only in household matters, but in infinite forms of knowledge that are the envy of men as well as women." Properzia had this unusual specialty in sculpture. Believe it or not, she specialized in carving miniatures out of peach pits. I didn't even know this was a thing, but apparently this was. And in the previous slide, that's what this is. You might have looked at this and said, come on, what's Charney showing us here? That is an elaborately carved peach pit. This was once an admired art form, which she, quote, "executed so well and with such patience that they were singular and marvelous to behold, not only for the subtlety of the work, but also for the grace of the little figures that she made in them, and the delicacy with which they were distributed. She even sculpted, quote, the whole Passion of Christ, wrought in most beautiful carving, with a vast number of figures, in addition to the apostles and the ministers of the crucifixion, in a single peach pit." I don't know how she pulled this off. Unfortunately, almost all of these are lost except for the one on the previous slide. So I don't know how she fit so many figures in, but it sounds very impressive. Vasari, who shows a level of misogyny depressingly normal for his era, was astounded that a woman could also hew marble, considering, quote, "their little hands so tender and white." Alas, her carved peach pits did not survive, aside from the one I showed you, but she was also known for her carved marble relief work, and a sculpture, the most famous of which was Joseph and Potiphar's Wife from 1526, which could be an indicative work of the High Renaissance. In fact, in my book, I have this as the exemplary work of the High Renaissance. I could have picked a sculpture by Michelangelo, for example, but instead, you could just as easily pick one by Properzia, and you can see it here. It's in the middle slide at the top. Sculpting in marble required considerable physical strength to go with the subtlety. It was messy, muscly work, leaving sculptors covered in dust and powdered stone, which may have made the medium appear less attractive to women than, say, the more elegant work with paint. As with so much high Renaissance art, the scene of Joseph and Potiphar's Wife is balanced and harmonious. There's some drama in the poses and flexed muscles, particularly of Potiphar's wife, whose robust arms and frankly unrealistic breasts recall Michelangelo's depiction of women, as muscled males with breasts added as an afterthought, rather than something more naturalistic. Potiphar's wife is shown as the sexual aggressor and is physically more capable of overcoming Joseph than the other way around. This is a powerful woman who will take what she wants, and was a rare example of work of this period that featured a woman as an aggressor. I'll just flip back so you can see that. I realize I should make this slide bigger for you, but You can also Google it, Joseph and Potiphar's Wife by Propia de Rossi. And then the lady with the super name. Vasari traveled through his native Italy and thought highly enough of Sophonisba Anguissola that he stopped in Cremona to visit her. Quote, "This year in Cremona, I saw in her father's house a painting by her hand made with such great diligence, and it showed her three sisters playing chess, and with them an old housemaid, with such diligence and attention that they truly seemed to be alive and missing nothing but the power of speech." This was Sophonisba's best-known painting, The Game of Chess from 1555. The Anguissola family belonged to Cremona's aristocracy, as indicated by the sisters' gorgeous brocades and the expensive lace at their collars and cuffs, in this group portrait made by Sophonisba, not to mention the fact that they had the leisure to play chess and study painting. Quote, "Their father, Amilcare Anguissola, ensured that his daughters had a superb education and promoted their skills in the arts without fearing that a career would compromise their marriageability. High birth granted them a certain degree of independence." Sophonisba was a proper star of her time. She studied with Michelangelo in Rome and was a court painter to King Philip II, the King of Spain. This demonstrates her independence and the support of her father in that he did not interfere. By contrast, Marietta Robusti, a daughter of the Venetian master Tintoretto, was an artist of such renown that she was invited to be the court painter to Emperor Maximilian II, and then by Philip II of Spain, and both times her father forbade her. Sophonisba's sophistication was such that she befriended Philip's wife, Queen Elizabeth of Valois. Such a friendship would not have been possible among those of vastly different social strata. She continued to work as a sought-after artist for decades. Her reputation was such that the great painter Antony van Dyck asked her to paint her portrait in 1624. He wanted to depict her when she was 92 years old, or so she claimed. She was actually 96, so she was trying to slip by as a little bit younger than she was, but she was 96 and claimed to be 92. Van Dyck commented that he learned more from her about painting than anyone else. While it's difficult to trace where artists acquired elements of their style, it's clear that there are aesthetic differences between the work of Van Dyck and of the master with whom he trained and initially worked, Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens's portraits are looser in terms of brushstroke, more painterly, which is a term that means the brushstrokes are visible, not smoothed out. Van Dyck's later work appears to be some halfway point between Rubens's brush strokey style and Sophonisba's unpainterly crispness. This painting on the right, Portrait of Elizabeth of Valois holding a portrait of Philip II, shows the third wife of Philip, the Habsburg emperor. The face, eyes, and hands are immediately arresting, stopping the viewer in our tracks. But the real star of the show is perhaps the gorgeous dress, its sleeves lined with fasteners crafted of diamonds and rubies, trimmed with velvet and woven through with silver and gold thread. Its front was studded with pearls, and it was hugely expensive. Its softness and texture are expertly conveyed by Sophonisba, but no easy feat to transform oil paints into something that feels like you could feel it with your fingers. This is an example of a painting that was once attributed to a male artist, in this case Sanchez Coelho. Too often the default assumption for truly great artworks is that they were surely the hand of a man. But analysis of the composition of the lead white paint used matches what Anguissola used in other paintings, differing from the chemical composition of paints employed by Coelho. Elaborate costumes, faces, and hands offer the best chance for artists to show off, as these were considered the most difficult for a painter to get right. There is also this look of quiet confidence in Elizabeth's face. Perhaps it took a female portraitist to highlight a woman's great interior qualities, while a male portraitist would cater to the male viewers of the work and convey only the superficial beauty of the princess, or show her in a more submissive light. I like the idea that Anguissola saw a kindred empowered woman in Elizabeth and helped preserve her legacy. The leading artistic style for both Sophonisba and Lavinia Fontana was mannerism, a movement that rose among the followers of Michelangelo. While high Renaissance art was all about harmony and balanced geometric compositions, mannerism expanded on Michelangelo's interest in hyperextending bodies and posing figures in elegant but unnatural forms, introducing bright colors, twisting, and bending for aesthetic effect. The movement also involved an interest in natural curiosities and wonders. The male painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo created portraits comprised of painted vegetables, for instance. Here we have Lavinia Fontana's portrait of Antonieta Gonzalez from 1595. That's the work on the left. And you probably did a double take when you first saw it. Antonieta, as well as her two sisters and her father, had a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis, which colloquially and not very sensitively is called werewolf syndrome. It causes abnormal hair growth on the face and the body. Hailing from the Canary Islands, her father is a historical point of reference as the first documented case of hypertrichosis in known history. The disease is incredibly rare, making it that much more surprising that all three Gonzalez sisters and their father had it. A doctor noted, quote, "The Gonzalez sisters were 1 in a billion, all three of them." Antonieta and her father toured the courts of Europe as living natural wonders. This was at a time when sensitivity was not on most people's minds, but the family made a comfortable living by exhibiting themselves. Antonieta is painted with much empathy by Lavinia, with lively eyes and a warm expression, that she happens to cloak in hair, which seems almost an afterthought. In her hands, Lavinia has painted her holding a document that describes an aspect of her story. It says, quote, "Don Pietro, a wild man discovered in the Canary Islands, was conveyed to His Most Serene Highness Henry the King of France, and from there came to His Excellency the Duke of Parma. This is where Lavinia likely met and was commissioned to portray Antonieta." Lavinia, who we see on the right, trained with her father Prospero Fontana, a painter in Bologna. She was truly the star of the family, and her husband, a painter named Paolo Zappi, was relegated to painting the draperies and the backgrounds of her work, which I quite like. As with Vasari's words of praise for Propia, one of Lavinia's patrons spoke warmly of her, albeit with that inbuilt misogyny that was the norm of the time. He said, quote, "This excellent painter, to say the truth, in every way prevails above the condition of her sex and is a most remarkable person." Of course, Lavinia was great by any standard, but though this sounds like damning with faint praise today, it was meant as a major compliment when it was penned in the 16th century. Lastly, for now, before we move on to influential women who were not artists, I wanted to highlight an art form that's often been dismissed as a mere craft, but which deserves proper treatment, and that is needlework. So the major art forms that steal the headlines are painting, sculpture, and architecture. Later on, printmaking and photography were added to the list. But there were many art forms that many other people considered mere crafts, but that should be considered on a par with the big three. They just have not been historically included. Too often art historians have a narrow view of which media count among the fine arts. This has historical roots. Painting, sculpture, and architecture have been the foci since the Renaissance. Countless other media were sidelined as crafts rather than art forms. But this is an artificial distinction, and many crafts were elevated by master artisans to realms as sophisticated as the more storied media. Among those many overlooked art forms, needlework stands out as one that was almost exclusively the realm of women, but which required no less skill, patience, and imagination and dedication as other media. And one of the most notable figures in the documented history of needlework was Elizabeth Talbot, who we see on the left, better known as Bess of Hardwick. She was among the most prominent figures in Elizabethan England, a brilliant woman who strategically married 4 times, each time adding to her wealth and power, which she used for good. Bess was renowned as a, quote, needlewoman, adept at decorative sewing and handicrafts involving textiles. This was an art form that was taught to noble women. An embroidered book cover by Queen Elizabeth I survives, created when she was only 11, but with a fascinating complex design of interlocking loops. Bess's first husband was briefly in charge of keeping Mary, Queen of Scots, captive at his estate Chatsworth House. There, Bess befriended Mary, and the two worked on a series of needlework hangings called the Oxburgh hangings, as they decorated a room in Oxburgh Hall, Norfolk, in England. The hangings were made between 1570 and 1585. They were designed by Mary, and Bess helped her with them for the first few years of the project. The design is hugely elaborate, and you see some examples from it here. with multiple hangings intended to decorate a wall, two bed curtains, and a valance, that's the skirting around a bed, as well as other elements of the room. There are over 100 panels within the hangings, with designs inspired by a collection of woodcut illustrations that Mary kept with her in captivity. Mary and Bess each signed the panels they made with their monogram initials, MA for Mary and ES for Bess. And you can see the ES in the second from the right of the panels in the picture. Bess's marriages led her to being described as, quote, one of the richest and most powerful women in the kingdom, reportedly the second richest in England, right behind Queen Elizabeth I. As a result, she was both an artist and a powerful patron of arts and architecture. She commissioned several buildings and likely also had significant influence on their design, including Hardwicke Hall, designed by Robert Smithson, which famously had a quantity of glazing that astounded those who saw it, leading to the rhyme, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. This design was influential on subsequent grand houses, and there's reason to think that Bess of Hardwicke was essentially the one who came up with the design, was Robert Smithson enacted it. So we've spoken about some female artists. I'd like to switch gears and talk about how women have influenced the art in other spheres. And just with an eye towards the time, I think we might skip over this slide and look at this one, and then we'll see if we have time to go back to it. I'm cherry picking here a little bit because there are many sections to the book and many examples in each one. And so I chose a few to pull out to illustrate the breadth of what I was trying to cover. And so there are a number of famous female patrons from all eras that we could call on. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about this one, Alexandra Lisowska, or Roxelana, which means the Russian girl, as she was called. She lived from 1505 to 1558, and she was an Ottoman princess, and you see her portrayed on the left by Titian. She rose from the most modest of origins as a villager in Rohatyn in modern Ukraine, when her village was sacked by Turkish soldiers and she was kidnapped. She was sold at a slave market in Istanbul and became concubine to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, one of 150 wives in his harem. From this most traumatic of starts, she rose to become his first wife, or the royal favorite. She was given the moniker Hürrem Sultan, meaning the joyful, and seemed to have enjoyed a loving union with the Sultan. Not only did he have more than one child with her, and tradition required that a sultan have only one child with any one member of his harem, but he also married her, thereby freeing her from concubinage and granting her the title of Haseki Sultan. She commissioned a palace complex in Constantinople called Haseki, designed by Mimar Sinan, which was like its own town with a hospital, soup kitchen, mosque, and school all part of it. She would also fund building projects throughout the Ottoman Empire, in Jerusalem and in Mecca, overseeing a territory which stretched at the time hundreds of thousands of miles and included an estimated 100 million people. After a fire damaged this palace, she moved into her husband's palace called Topkapi, which was likewise unheard of. The wives in the harem would stay in one spot, the sultan had his own palace, so she was essentially breaking all sorts of rules effectively as queen and co-empress when this was not the done thing. It was so unusual that this led to what was called the Reign of Women. At her encouragement, the Sultan built the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent, as Muzaffar Uzgelis wrote, quote, and reshaped the patronage of all Ottoman women builders who came after her. It was said that Roxolana was not particularly beautiful, but her wit, charm, and goodness won her the Sultan's heart and made her the most influential woman in the history of the Ottoman Empire. From patrons, we might go to influencers, which is a bit of a modern term, but by this I mean people who influence the course of art, how we think about it, how we engage with it. And there are a number of very influential women, particularly patrons and influencers in the 20th century in the US, who founded the most famous museums. And there was a particular link between empowered women influencers and introducing America to modern art, which was not considered the highest end art, not considered as socially acceptable. Conservative America liked old masters, and it was considered a little bit edgy and a little bit, suspicious to be interested in contemporary artists and European contemporary artists. Nowadays, of course, we know the wonders of Picasso, Miro, Chagall, Dali, and whatnot, but it was looked on with suspicion, particularly in the first decades of the 20th century. And we have a lot of very strong women to thank for bringing modern art to popularity in America. A number of prominent wealthy women, the original ladies who lunch, a term that may sound pejorative, but the implication of the idiom is that they're influential society women who meet over power lunches to shape new trends. And perhaps the most famous example of all were the co-founders of New York's Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA. There are three of them, and they had a very famous lunch together that led to the foundation of what is the most famous and influential modern art museum probably in the world. The first was Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. Her tastes were modern and avant-garde, which ran against the grain in her society's circles. Her husband was a stoic conservative curmudgeon, John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of the oil magnate. She bought up works by Georgia O'Keeffe, Diego Rivera, and Matisse, all of whom were considered far too radical to be in good taste. She was a famous hostess and philanthropist, particularly interested in championing women's rights and women in the arts. She ignored the mutterings of her husband and his circle of friends and did what she felt compelled to do. She hosted Matisse for lunch, was friends with the painter Marguerite Zorak, and commissioned Diego Rivera to paint a mural at Rockefeller Center, the fanciest among her husband's many properties. And there's a funny outtake to this. The mural was sadly and absurdly destroyed in 1934 for the silly reason that Rivera had included a portrait of Lenin in it. Also at this lunch was Lily P. Bliss, whose Boston family ran a textile empire. She was parallel to the perhaps more famous Isabella Stewart Gardner in her anti-establishment, devil-may-care approach to life. Isabella Stewart Gardner is, of course, the subject of another chapter in the Brushed Aside book. I just happened to pick Lily P. Bliss and her luncheon colleagues as the example that I would give you in today's talk instead. So she was among the earliest modern art collectors in America, buying up the work of Monet, Gauguin, Modigliani, Seurat, Daumier, Picasso, Pissarro, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Cézanne. Now, all these are big rock star names now, but this was an edgy thing to do at the time. In a 1931 catalog of Bliss's collection, it was written that, quote, she was an advocate for modern art when it had few admirers, a patron when it had almost no market. While Bliss and Aldrich Rockefeller were among the uber wealthy, the third key cog in the foundation of the museum was of humbler pedigree. Mary Quinn Sullivan was an art teacher and an artist herself, as well as an activist. She studied art at Pratt in New York and studied art education in Europe. She bought her first pieces at the famous 1913 Armory Show, which was a famous show because it introduced European modernists to the American market. She married a rare book collector, and together they expanded their art collection to include many of the big names of the time, especially Modigliani, Picasso, Van Gogh, and Cézanne. So these three women met for lunch in November of 1929 with a new plan in mind: to open a public museum focused exclusively on contemporary art. No such museum existed in New York at the time. It predated the Guggenheim by a decade, and there were few elsewhere. Contemporary art was seen as the realm of salons, shows like that Armory Show, and galleries where you could buy the art. Museums were reserved only for the old classics. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, quote, routinely refused to show or accept donations of contemporary artwork. If you saw the list of things that the Met poo-pooed and said, I'm not interested in this, you would be amazed. But it didn't take long for this to catch on. Aldrich Rockefeller encouraged her husband to donate some of his real estate to provide the museum with a sculpture garden and to underwrite the entire museum project. Before the year had passed, the Museum of Modern Art would open at 730 Fifth Avenue. Its collection was kickstarted by Bliss, who donated the 150 best pieces from her private stash to it. She would also spend the next 2 years until her death at the helm of the museum. Aldrich Rockefeller donated 181 works to MoMA, as it would be known, including pieces by Van Gogh and Seurat. Quinn Sullivan developed the didactic and educational aspect of the proposed Museum of Modern Art. The museum would become the preeminent institution on art that was, when it was founded, quote, contemporary, and which has since become recognized as modern. So we really have them to thank for effectively introducing modern art to America and making it a thing. The last example I thought I would give you today is an example of a scholar. And again, I pulled out loads of examples in the book. There's a whole section in the book about the most famous feminist art essay by Linda Nochlin, a wonderful art historian, which I argue is actually not as empowering to women or as pro-feminist as it would seem when I do a very close reading of it and point out that from my perspective, while it's a very clever essay and it's trying to be provocative in the title is inherently problematic, as is Nochlin's argument, because the title is, "Why have there been no great women artists?" And I would certainly and vehemently argue, and I do so in the book, that there have in fact been many great women artists. So aspects of the book are looking at feminist art history and maybe looking at it from a different perspective. But when I was thinking about which scholar to show you this evening, the most obvious choice is one who is inarguably one of the most influential scholars of the 20th century. One cannot write about photography or visual theory in general without invoking the work of Susan Sontag. She was one of America's most respected and prominent public intellectuals from the late 1960s until her death in 2004. Her theories include the idea that art has overtaken the role that religion, whether formal like Catholicism or generally one's spiritual or mystical tendencies, once provided, a role that was important for the psyche. That unknowing or having aspects of one's life that cannot be scientifically squared away or defined is productive. It quenches our human craving for the cloud of unknowing beyond knowledge and the silence beyond speech. That's a quote of hers. So that might sound a little complicated, but effectively she's saying in the 20th century, the world has grown far less religious than it once was, but humans still need to be confronted with things that they can't explain. And effectively, art has replaced religion as the great thing that people can't explain but engages the psyche. Conceptual art, in particular, was what she had in mind. Conceptual art that was not easily explained away through a series of equations. If we look at traditional art, we might be able to say, you know, symbol X equals this, symbol Y means that. But conceptual art or abstract art now serves the role that the mystical myths of religion once did, now that so much of our modern world is a-religious. This is maybe the best summary of her overarching theory. She wrote on a wide array of subjects, though, and the most famous of her books came out in 1977. It's called On Photography, and it's still required reading for students of the subject. She wrote that photography leads to a chronic voyeuristic relation to the world. We are so inundated with images, with the ubiquity of photography, that each photograph tends to be stripped of meaning and weight. We want to see more and more, but it results in an indifference to what we see, an attitude of anti-intervention. Basically, she was writing about how the quantity of images, and this is in 1977, today, you know, if she were around in this era of AI-generated images, fake news, social media, which she didn't really live to see, then it really hammers home her point even more. Even in the 70s, she's saying, we're hit with so many images that an individual image has lost its power to move us and affect us. And that's a shame, because images used to be a powerful tool. It's you would see something and want to do something about it. And there are famous examples. I should have added it to this slideshow, but if you are familiar with Dorothea Lange's Immigrant Mother, a photograph of a Dust Bowl mother who's been displaced and is in a camp with all these children, and you see this amazingly powerful look on her face. She doesn't know what the future will hold or how she's going to take care of her family, but she seems strong and determined. It's very powerful, and it was really moving to people in an era, this was back in the 1930s, when people didn't have this overflow of images all the time. And so her theories about how too many images basically desensitizes us to them is even more true today than it was when she was writing it. On Photography won the National Book Critics Award for Criticism. In 1998, critic Michael Starenko wrote, quote, "On Photography has become so deeply absorbed into this discourse that Sontag's claims about photography, as well as her mode of argument, have become part of the rhetorical toolkit photography theorists and critics carry around in their heads. It does not get any more influential than that." So I have lots of other stories, but I think I'm amazingly exactly on time to stop the slideshow and turn to answering your questions. So I'm going to click stop share. Am I amazingly on time, Nina?
You are. I was just about to text you.
Okay, great. So I am delighted to answer questions because I have all the time you need for me. So you just let me know what's good for you, and Mina's, I guess, going to feed me the questions that she thinks are most apt.
I am, and I'm going to ask people to put your questions in the Q&A. I know you'll have lots, but I'm going to start with this question about AI. I mean, that isn't even part of maybe your conversation, but like, do you think that that's going to be the next turn in artistry for the world?
So this is a great question. I just got back from the Frankfurt Book Fair, and I was there. Authors have no business to be there, but I was there because Slovenia, my adopted country, was the guest of honor. And so I was part of the Slovenia team. We were like the nerdy Olympic team representing our country. And I moderated several panels on AI in art and writing. And that's a big question. So it's fascinating what it can do. It's both fascinating and a little creepy because it's really very good. Um, there's two ways to approach it. One is in terms of writing, and one is in terms of creating images. So I'll just briefly mention both. From a writing perspective, it's a helpful tool. It's very good at translation, but at the moment it writes essays and articles like a high school student, and they're very simplistic. And because it doesn't tell you where it gets information, it often gets things wrong. So the thing is, by the time we finish this talk, it's probably going to be improved already because of the pace that technology advances. But at this point, it's only really good as a curiosity, or you can ask it a question instead of Google searching it. But there's a good chance it's going to give you the wrong information because it grabs whatever it finds most often, and it doesn't tell you where it's getting it from. And there's a good chance that it's giving you wrong information. From an image generation perspective, the way I would answer the question is to go back to Aristotle, which sounds like I'm being super pretentious, right? But I promise I'm not. So during the Renaissance, Renaissance scholars looked at Aristotle's book on poetics, which happened to have survived from ancient Athens to the Renaissance, and looked at how he described what made for a good work of art. And what he meant by this was usually a poem or a drama. But it was adapted by Renaissance scholars and applied to works of art. And there were three questions he said you should ask. First, is it good? By which he means, does it exhibit skill and successfully achieve what the creator started out doing? Two, is it beautiful, which is a subjective decision? And three, is it interesting? So if we apply this is how art has traditionally been judged to an AI image creation. The main problem is that it's inherently going to be derivative, even if it looks pretty. So it could feel beautiful. It doesn't exhibit skill because it's not part of a human creation. Even if it looks like what you're doing is projecting. If a human were to do this, I would be impressed by it. But because it's a computer cobbling it together, it doesn't have that impressive skill level. Is it interesting? Well, it's more about the person putting in the inputs, keywords. Are they putting things together that are interesting? And then what points of reference you have as the viewer when you're looking at it. So it basically doesn't work in the traditional way of thinking of works of art, but it's pretty cool. So I think at this point, it's cool, but it's not creating works of art in the proper traditional sense.
Oh, sorry. Somebody asks, who's the most, in your opinion, underrated female artist?
What a good question. I have never been asked this question before. Bravo to whoever asked an underrated female artist. I the first one who came to mind was Sophanes Anguissola, and I know I just mentioned her, and just because I like saying her name, that's not the only reason, but this is an artist who is absolutely at the level of all of the great Renaissance portraitists, all the ones you've heard of, Raphael, Leonardo, you name it. And she was praised in her own time, but then she was largely sidelined, and her paintings were often reassigned to a man because the assumption was they were too good to be by a woman. And I'm not sure if she's the most underrated one because she was so lavishly praised while she was alive. But today, the fact that nobody's heard of her, I think, is a shame. And we tend to focus on the same few dozen famous male artists who were revolutionaries and started movements. And that's reasonable because few women started movements because essentially they were elbowed out of being as influential as they might have been.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that they should be ignored. And so I'd like to try to pull them into the spotlight. So that's my sort of cheating answer to that.
I like it. Somebody else asks, many museum and art scholars seem to shy away from acknowledging the genius and artistry of photographer Vivian Mayer. What is your view of her work and her legacy?
This is a very good question. She's someone who I actually didn't include in my photography section. And now I'm thinking that maybe I should have. But what I was trying to do, here's my excuse. What I was trying to do is show that I could teach an entire history of art in all media using only female artists as representatives. And so she wasn't one of the ones I chose. I can mention who I included. So Julia Margaret Cameron, Dorothea Lange, Diane Arbus, Graciela Iturbide, Cindy Sherman. And I certainly could have included other people, but she didn't make the final cut. My publisher gave me a maximum page count. That's my other excuse. So volume 2 will include her. But to be honest, I didn't focus on her enough to have something wise to say at the moment. But that is one of the many people I would love to have included.
I'm going to go to a comment here because I think this is really interesting. Dorothy Lange's Migrant Mother is still a moving image, almost negating your comment about seeing so much work. But I'm curious to what your opinion about that is in terms of age. Like I'm old enough to really have been moved by that. But because the younger generation does see so many things in image, is it less impactful to them?
So really great works of art are always going to have an impact, and her picture is one of them. I think the premise that Sontag was after, and the reason why it's even more relevant today than when she was writing about it, is we have these like phones that we keep flipping through, and it's just an ocean of images. And how often do we flip through something and we're barely registering it? And if we took the time to look at something, if something is printed and it's on a wall in a museum, we're going to give it our attention. But there was a study once, I would like to remember which museum it was, that people spend an average of 3 seconds looking at each piece in a museum. So we need to, I think, take more time and embrace slowness in order to give images the opportunity to remain with us. Because now with this over image-based culture, and now it's not even images, it's short films as well, something needs to be so outrageous or so distinctive that we stop and give it 2 seconds instead of 1 second. And that's considered a success in social media terms. And we're just overwhelmed by it. So I think if we, not looking at things digitally, it's been demonstrated that people have much more attention span with an analog experience. I see this when I write magazine articles. An online article, they think your attention span is 800 words long. A print article, it's 1,500 words long. Immigrant Mother sitting on a wall of a gallery is going to move anybody, especially a parent. But flipping through, even that image can lose its power because we have this programmed instinct to want more and more images, with each one being less powerful than it could be.
Yeah, that's a shame. Nancy asks your thoughts on why Frida Kahlo was not as recognized as Diego Rivera during their New York City years.
That's a good question. It's complicated. She was really skyrocketed to fame only quite recently, a few decades ago, with that very good biography and the filmography. It's easy to forget that just prior to that, she was well thought of, but she wasn't like the household name that she was after that. So it really helps when you have a major retrospective. It helps when you have a best-selling biography. It helps when you have a biopic about your life. Um, Diego Rivera was such a charismatic, larger than life figure, physically larger than life, uh, provocative in the news. You know, he was asking for trouble when he puts Lenin into this super capitalist mural, which would have been his most prestigious creation. The two of them had a really problematic, tumultuous relationship. Frida Kahlo also had some struggles with her mental well-being. And she shifted styles on a number of occasions. There's a lot of her self-portraits that we know of, but she was really a very good surrealist painter as well. And her oeuvre really became famous only posthumously, whereas Diego Rivera was just kicking butt, being a rock star during his life. So I think that's why. And but you know, hats off to anyone who's bringing even posthumously these icons back into the spotlight. So we just can only hope that more of them happen in terms of bringing other female artists back into the light.
Absolutely. Somebody asked, is there any research out there to support the presence of non-binary artists, for example, Claude Cahun, who experimented with gender in their works and presentations?
This is such a good question. It's an important question. There are artists who I cover in the book who would probably today recognize themselves in those terms. Um, but this was a discussion I had with my editor, and we basically had to narrow it to a more historical self-definition of woman, because otherwise it would have just gotten too expansive. So there are some examples in the book. The artist you mentioned is not one that I included, but there are a handful, and it's an important issue, but it's probably best served for its own book. It's not something that we focused on in this one.
Mm-hmm. You spoke about Kahlo and Rivera already, but can you speak a bit more about the influence of those husband-wife artists like Hoppers, the O'Keeffe and Stieglitz on the growth of women as artists?
Yes. So here's the problem with that. I have a whole section in the book about a famous New York gallery show that was husband and wife artist teams. And the problem was that the women always got short shrift and were essentially not of interest to the almost exclusively male journalists covering the show.
Mm.
And there's some great examples. Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson, Lee Craster, Jackson Pollock, Helen and Willem de Kooning. There's so many examples of it. And in each example, really the man outshadowed the woman. And it's a real shame. And so I think that while that's inherently interesting to people, it's not necessarily in the best interest of the female artist because they tend to be looked at in as sort of a competition with the husband and losing out, whether that's objectively true or just the viewpoint of unfortunately too many male critics. But I have a whole chapter on that in the book, and so if that's of interest, I would point you there.
Madeline asks, is the chess game in a museum where it can be viewed by the public?
It is, but now you got me because I can't remember which museum it's in, but it absolutely is. I mean, hang on just a sec. Game of chess, Sophanes. Let me see if I can answer that in 1 second because it absolutely is. Um, Not to make you wait. That's why I haven't seen it. It's in the National Museum of Poznan in Poland. So it's
Oh.
not on everyone's traffic pattern, but maybe it should be. Go on an artistic pilgrimage to check it out.
I think we need to take a field trip. Um, I'm not quite sure what we're getting at with this question, but which models did you write about in the book?
So I do have a section on models and muses, which is something that is useful to talk about. A lot of them were artists themselves, and some of them were very influential. And there's a whole section, for example, on pre-Raphaelites. And there were pre-Raphaelite models. Many of them were the wives of pre-Raphaelite artists. I wrote about Louise Joplin, who is a great painter in her own right, but also was a model. We have people like Camille Claudel, who was an assistant of Rodin and was every bit as skillful a sculptor and also worked as a model for him. Um, so there were models who were professional artists themselves. Some of them were professional models. A lot of models were from lower class walks of life and were prostitutes, because the idea that you would basically remove your clothes in the presence of a stranger was associated with prostitution, and the fact that they were regulars in paintings, for example. Certain artists had favorite models who appear regularly. There's the model, for example, for Venus in Botticelli's Primavera and The Birth of Venus is someone whose name has come down to us. Many of Caravaggio's model friends come down to us. And some of them were influential in and of themselves. I tried to mention only those who really seemed to influence the artists they posed for, or also artists themselves. And the most obvious example is the chapter on the pre-Raphaelites, because they were great artists as well as inspirations, muses, and models for the men around them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask the last question because I'm really curious.
Okay.
I was curious about your comment about, I'm not going to remember names and I'm certainly not going to pronounce them right, but a male artist going to a female artist's house and seeing that her art was up in the house. And then they liked the art so much that they really supported their work. It was early on in your presentation and I was totally listening, but now I've forgotten the names. But I'm wondering if, and this is sort of like almost a personal question, because one of my aunts is a very good artist, but she only has art in the house, never displayed anywhere because it was not valued. So do you think that that might be something more that was happening historically for women, that they were artists? They also, as an aside, I don't think, my own personal opinion is that no artist would not do sculpting just because it was dirty, but that's just me. But like, yeah, do you think that there's some value to people having home galleries of their own work, especially for women?
A very good question, but it's also a very modern question. So today we display art at home regularly that maybe we make, but that wouldn't really have been the done thing until the 20th century. There are artists who created art really until we get to about the 19th century. You don't have artists creating unless it's on commission, because the raw materials are often prohibitively expensive. So what we have are women doing art or crafts as a hobby, and therefore and usually from the aristocracy, and they're very independently wealthy, and this is seen as an elegant pastime for them, but they're not intended to do it professionally, and they're not trying to sell it, they're not trying to show it to people other than family, for example. Or you have people whose usually father is an artist, and therefore they're able to learn behind the scenes. And they're also unlikely to be selling it, because you had to become a master with a guild system in order to sell it, or you had to go show at a salon later on. So it's a good question, but it's a question that's really more a 20th century and beyond question than one that would be relevant for the past centuries.
Yeah, I guess it kind of, the term starving artist is like, people, it is something that you still have to live your life. You still have to be able to pay for your life. And even back then, well, especially back then, it sounds like it just wasn't, you just couldn't do it for fun.
That you basically couldn't do it for fun. And part of it came down to the fact that it was not until the 19th century that you could buy paints. You had to buy very expensive pigments and grind them yourself. And some of the pigments, like lapis lazuli for cobalt blue, was the single most expensive thing by weight that you could buy on planet Earth. It was more expensive than gold or saffron or you name it.
Wow.
So raw materials were so expensive that people wouldn't do things on spec, not until really we have this starting in the 17th century a little bit, and then really 18th century on. But maybe I'll just finish with one fun little anecdote. So we associate abstract expressionism with Jackson Pollock, especially his grip paintings. But that was actually invented by a Ukrainian American housewife grandmother
Hmm.
named Janet Sobel. And she's the opening chapter of my book. And Jackson Pollock admitted that he learned the technique from her. She has a painting using the drip technique that was finished a year before he made his first one. But he's the one who made it famous. He got the credit for it. He was the front man for it. And this is a shame. So we need to do our best to pull the Janet Sobels of the world back into the spotlight.
Well, that is a great note to end on, that we have work to do. Thank you, Noah. This has been fascinating, and people obviously really enjoyed it in the chat and are going to run out and get your book, because it's not only insightful, it's beautiful. So definitely check it out. I hope to have you back when, I think we're talking about the Mona Lisa time, right? Maybe
I
February.
would love to come back in February. I have a book about Mona Lisa. I would love to come back anytime you'll have me.
I will be in touch. So everybody, thank you so much for being here and spending your afternoon with us. I know it's gorgeous out here in Massachusetts, so I appreciate your time. And have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much, Noah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.